The air inside the wooden council house was thick with the scent of sweat, tobacco and candle smoke. The low murmur of voices barely masked the tension rippling through the room. On one side of the long, scarred table sat Colonel Jacob Henshaw, his weathered hands clasped in front of him, knuckles white. Opposite him, Chief Tahuka of the Comanche sat still as stone, his dark eyes unreadable. The flickering lamplight cast jagged shadows across his sharp features, the deep lines around his mouth carved by years of war and loss. Behind the colonel, men armed with rifles leaned against the walls, their fingers twitching near triggers, distrust coiling in their shoulders. The Comanche warriors flanking their chief mirrored the tension, their faces impassive but their bodies alert, coiled like panthers waiting to strike. Between them lay the fragile remnants of a peace treaty, one already stained with the blood of past betrayals. Tahuka's voice, deep and measured, cut through the silence. Your people speak of peace, yet they build walls, dig trenches, and push farther into our land. Henshaw exhaled through his nose, shifting in his seat. We don't seek more war, Chief. Enough men have died on both sides. He let the weight of his words settle before he continued. We need a way to seal this peace, a bond that can't be broken by greed or bloodlust. Tahuka did not respond immediately. He had seen too many agreements crumble, too many handshakes turned to rifle fire, and yet his people could not endure another winter of war. He had lost warriors, sons, and now he sat across from men who had once ordered his kind shot on sight, speaking of peace as if the past had not been etched in blood. The colonel leaned forward. A marriage. The word hovered in the air like a vulture circling a dying animal. Tahuka's warriors stiffened. He felt the weight of their stares, felt his own breath deepen as the meaning behind the proposal sank in. My daughter, Henshaw pressed on, his voice a knife cutting through the thick silence. Julia. At the far end of the room, a sharp intake of breath drew every eye. Julia Henshaw stood in the doorway, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. She had not been invited to this meeting, had not even been told of the colonel's plan. She had come only to confront him about the whispers in town, but now the truth was out, and it crashed over her like a flood. Her father's gaze locked onto her, warning her to stay silent. But Julia was not the type to hold her tongue. You would sell me off like a piece of cattle, she spat, her voice trembling with fury. To a man I do not know, to people I have been raised to fear. Henshaw's jaw clenched. This isn't about you, Julia. It's about preventing war. Tahuka watched her with quiet intensity. She was small compared to the warriors in the room, but there was fire in her, defiance that reminded him of the Comanche women who stood unshaken even in the face of death. She had the look of someone who had spent her life fighting against expectations, though she likely never imagined this battle. Julia turned her glare toward him. And you? Would you take a wife forced into this union? A woman who would rather run into the wild and face wolves than share your bed? Tahuka's expression did not change, but his gaze did not waver. A marriage for peace is not a marriage of the heart, he said, his voice calm, deliberate. It is a duty, one I will accept if it means no more of my people will die. She let out a bitter laugh. So that's it, I am duty. Henshaw stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. It is decided. Julia's breath hitched. I have a say in this. No, her father interrupted. You do not. The finality in his voice sent ice down her spine. He had made up his mind long before she entered the room. The marriage was arranged for the following evening. The sun dipped low over the plains, casting the Comanche camp in hues of copper and gold. The ceremony was sparse, no celebration, no joy. Julia stood stiffly, wrapped in a simple linen dress, her blonde hair loose around her shoulders. Beside her, Tahuka was silent, his expression unreadable. He had donned his finest deerskin, his long hair bound with beads of turquoise and bone. The elders spoke the words that bound them, voices deep and measured, ancient traditions pressed into a moment neither of them had chosen. When it was done, a blanket was draped over their shoulders, symbolizing unity. Julia felt the weight of it, but there was no warmth in the gesture. No one cheered, no one smiled. The settlers had already begun drinking, a handful toasting to peace, with hollow laughter and cheap whiskey. The Comanche remained watchful, their silence louder than the revelry. Julia's heart pounded as she turned toward the waiting horses. She had tried to steel herself for this moment, but dread clawed at her throat. This was not just a marriage, it was an exile. She was leaving behind everything she had ever known, riding into a world where she was unwanted. Tahuka mounted his horse, looking down at her. When she hesitated, he extended his hand. For a moment she stared at it, refusing the gesture out of sheer defiance. Then, with a deep breath, she took it. His grip was strong, steady, but it did not feel like comfort. It felt like a chain snapping into place. The journey began in silence. The Comanche warriors moved like shadows through the land, their horses swift and tireless. Julia struggled to match their pace, her fingers clenching the reins until her knuckles ached. The further they rode from the settlement, the smaller it became in the distance, until it was nothing but a smudge against the horizon. She swallowed against the lump in her throat. There was no turning back. Hours passed. The wind whispered through, the tall grass carrying the scent of earth and rain. The vast open land stretched endlessly before her, and for the first time she understood just how far from home she truly was. Her horse stumbled on uneven ground, and she barely caught herself before falling. A curse slipped from her lips, but before she could right herself, a firm hand closed around her wrist. Tahuka was beside her, steadying her without a word. She yanked her arm free. "I don't need your help." His gaze held hers, steady, unwavering. "Then ride better." Julia's temper flared, but before she could snap back, he spurred his horse forward. She bit the inside of her cheek, swallowed her pride, and forced herself to keep up. The night grew colder. The stars blinked overhead, distant and indifferent. They stopped to rest in a secluded valley, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. The Comanche warriors spoke quietly amongst themselves, their voices low and melodic. Julia sat apart, her arms wrapped around herself, watching the fire flicker. Tahuka approached, offering her a blanket. She hesitated, staring at the woven fabric as though it were a trick. "You will freeze," he said simply. She took it, though her fingers trembled slightly. As she draped it over her shoulders, she caught his gaze across the fire. He was studying her, not with cruelty, but with something else, something unreadable. She held his stare for a long moment before turning away. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was certain. This was only the beginning. The sky stretched endlessly overhead, an expanse of muted greys and bruised purples as the sun dipped beyond the western ridges. The wind carried the scent of damp earth, rolling over the land like a restless ghost. Julia's legs ached from riding, her fingers raw from gripping the reins too tightly, but she refused to complain. If she showed weakness, she feared what little ground she had gained in these silent, watchful days would be lost. Tahuka rode. Ahead, his posture relaxed yet alert, his dark hair shifting with each gust of wind. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words were sharp and purposeful. She had learned to watch him, to read the slight shifts in his body language. When his shoulders stiffened, it meant something unseen stirred in the distance. When he slowed, his horse, the others, did the same without question. He was a leader, and though she resented the life she had been forced into, she could not deny his quiet command over his people. The Comanche warriors had kept their distance since their departure from the settlement, their gazes unreadable, their acceptance of her reluctant at best. The only one who occasionally acknowledged her presence was Takaani, an older woman who rode near the center of the group, her dark eyes filled with something close to pity. The land was nothing like the world she had grown up in. There were no fences, no roads, no signs of the order and structure that the settlers clung to. Here nature reigned vast and untamed, with rolling plains that bled into jagged canyons and distant mountains. Julia had never felt so small. The storm came swiftly. The wind shifted first, sudden and sharp, cutting through the growing dusk with a bitter chill. Tahuka pulled his horse to a halt, lifting his chin toward the heavy clouds rolling in from the west. "We make camp here," he said, his voice barely carrying over the rising wind. The others obeyed without question, moving with practiced efficiency as they dismounted and began gathering what little dry wood they could find. Julia hesitated, unsure of what to do, before following their lead. She crouched beside Takani, mimicking her as she arranged kindling beneath the stacked branches. Her fingers fumbled, unskilled, but she pushed forward, determined not to appear useless. A rumble of thunder rolled across the land, low and threatening. The wind picked up, lashing against her exposed skin, tearing at her dress. She clenched her jaw and tried again, striking the flint against the steel Takani had handed her. Sparks danced but failed to catch. Tahuka crouched beside her without a word. His hands, scarred from years of battle, moved with ease as he adjusted the wood, sheltering it from the wind. He struck the flint once, twice, then fire flickered to life. Small and fragile. Julia swallowed the bitter taste of frustration. "You rely too much on force," he said, his voice calm. "Fire does not answer to strength, it answers to patience." She hated how easily he could see through her. The rain came in heavy sheets, forcing them to retreat beneath an overhang of rock. The flames sputtered and died, plunging them into near darkness. Julia shivered, her dress soaked through, her fingers numb. Without a word, Tahuka pulled a blanket from his saddle and draped it over her shoulders. She flinched at the gesture, at the unexpected kindness. Their eyes met briefly in the dim light, and for a moment she saw something there, an acknowledgement perhaps, not understanding, not yet, but something less than hostility. She clutched the blanket tighter and turned away. When the storm passed, they rode again, the ground soft and treacherous beneath their horses. The air smelled clean, the world around them reborn under the washed-out light of dawn. The silence between them remained, but it had changed. It was no longer weighted by resentment alone. The journey was slow, the terrain growing harsher with each passing mile. Julia learned to adapt, to move with the rhythm of the horse instead of against it, to watch the land as Tahuka did, searching for signs of danger. It came sooner than she expected. The first howl drifted through the still air like a whisper. Of death. The Comanche warriors reacted instantly, their hands moving to their weapons, their horses shifting uneasily beneath them. Tahuka's expression did not change, but his posture did. He was listening, waiting. Another howl. Closer. Julia's throat went dry. Wolves. Tahuka turned to her. "Stay close." The pack emerged from the tall grass like ghosts, their eyes glinting in the fading light. They were lean, desperate, their ribs pressing against matted fur. The lead wolf let out a low growl, lips curling over yellowed teeth. The horses stomped and huffed, restless. Then, like a shadow breaking, the first wolf lunged. Tahuka moved faster than she thought possible, his knife flashing as he slashed at the beast, sending it yelping back into the dark. Another leapt toward her horse, and she barely managed to stay in the saddle as it snapped at her boot. The warriors fought without hesitation, their movements precise, controlled. Arrows flew, knives found their mark. Julia's breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She reached for the small blade Takani had given her and gripped it tightly, though she had no idea what she would do with it. The wolves hesitated, sensing their disadvantage. Blood stained the ground. Their leader growled, then turned sharply, disappearing into the night. The others followed, vanishing as swiftly as they had come. The silence that followed was deafening. Julia's hands shook. She felt sick. Tahuka approached her, his own breathing steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through the group. His gaze swept over her, assessing. "You are not hurt." It was not a question, but a statement. She shook her head, unable to find her voice. He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. "Good." Then he walked away as if nothing had happened. She watched him, something unreadable twisting in her chest. By the time they reached the Comanche village, the land had shifted. The open plains gave way to rolling hills, scattered with trees and winding streams. Smoke curled from distant fires, and the sound of voices, dozens of them, carried on the breeze. The warriors were met with cautious eyes. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts. Men regarded her with thinly veiled mistrust. Julia straightened her spine, refusing to shrink beneath their scrutiny. Tahuka dismounted first, then turned to her. This was it. The point of no return. She hesitated only for a moment before swinging her leg over the saddle, landing on unsteady feet. The village watched in silence. Then, without a word, Tahuka turned and walked toward the largest lodge, the fabric of his tunic brushing against her as he passed. He did not check to see if she would follow. He already knew she would. The village stirred at dawn, voices rising with the crackling of early fires. Smoke coiled into the cold morning air as warriors prepared for the hunt, their horses restless and eager. Julia watched from a distance, standing at the edge of the lodge she now shared with Tahuka. Though weeks had passed since her arrival, she still felt the weight of eyes on her, the unspoken judgment of those who saw her as an outsider. Tahuka emerged from the lodge, his expression unreadable as always. His presence had become familiar to her, his quiet strength something she no longer feared but respected. He moved with purpose, every step deliberate, every glance carrying meaning. She had come to understand that his silence was not coldness but control. A commotion near the entrance of the village drew his attention. A rider, dust-streaked and breathless, galloped in, his horse lathered with sweat. The air shifted as the village gathered, an unspoken tension settling over them like a storm cloud. Tahuka stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. Warrior slid from his horse, panting. "Settlers," he said in Comanche. "They raided our hunting party, 5 dead. They left their bodies to rot." A chill ran through Julia's spine. Murmurs spread like wildfire. The warriors gripped their weapons, fury smoldering in their eyes. Takani muttered a curse under her breath, her fingers tightening around the beads she wore. Tahuka did not move at first, but Julia could see the way his jaw clenched, the slight shift in his stance. "Who?" he asked. The warrior hesitated, then, reluctantly, "Colonel Henshaw's men." The world tilted. Julia's breath caught in her throat, her stomach twisting into knots. "No," she whispered. Tahuka turned his gaze to her, but his expression did not soften. His eyes, dark and unreadable, held hers for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady. "We ride at sunset." The village erupted in a flurry of movement. Warriors prepared their bows, checked their rifles, and tightened the leather straps of their saddles. The scent of burning sage filled the air. Prayers whispered under breath as they made ready for war. Julia moved through the chaos, her heart pounding. She found Tahuka near the corral, tightening the reins on his horse. "You can't do this," she said, her voice sharp, desperate. He did not look at her. "Your people broke the treaty." "Not my people," she shot back. "Not all of them, you know that." Finally he turned, his gaze heavy with something she couldn't place. "You would defend them after what they did?" She swallowed hard. "I would stop. This before more people die." The wind whispered between them. For a long moment neither spoke. Then, without another word, Tahuka mounted his horse and rode toward the waiting warriors. Julia watched him disappear into the gathering dusk, fear curling around her ribs like a vice. The attack came before dawn. Julia woke to the sound of gunfire, to the screams of women and the thunder of hooves. The settlers had come first. The village was in chaos. Warriors rushed to defend their home, arrows flying through the air, blades clashing in the flickering firelight. Smoke burned Julia's lungs as she stumbled from the lodge, her heart slamming. Against her ribs, a figure loomed in the darkness, Colonel Henshaw. Her father's face was drawn tight, his eyes wild. He gripped a rifle in one hand, his coat stained with dust and sweat. Behind him, settlers moved like ghosts through the smoke, rifles raised, cutting down anything in their path. "Julia," he breathed, stepping toward her. "Come, now." She took a step back. "No." A flicker of something, confusion, disbelief, crossed his face. "You don't belong here," he said, voice strained. "These savages don't," she snapped, anger burning through her fear. "Don't say that. Don't pretend you didn't start this war." His jaw tightened. I'm taking you home. She shook her head. This is my home now. The words surprised even her, but they rang true. Before he could respond, a gunshot split the air to Tahuka. He moved through the battlefield like a shadow, cutting down men with ruthless precision. His gaze found hers across the chaos, and something in his expression changed. Relief, fear, anger. Then he saw Henshaw. Julia barely had time to react before Tahuka charged forward. Henshaw raised his rifle, but he was too slow. Tahuka tackled him to the ground, his blade pressing against the colonel's throat. Henshaw struggled, but Tahuka was stronger, faster. For a moment time stood still. Julia took a shaky breath. Don't. Tahuka didn't move. His muscles were tense, his breathing ragged. He is not worth your soul, she whispered. Slowly, Tahuka eased back. He did not sheath his blade, but he did not strike. Instead he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. Leave, and do not return. Henshaw's eyes burned with hatred, but he knew he had lost. He staggered to his feet, spitting. Blood onto the dirt. This isn't over, he growled. Then he was gone, vanishing into the smoke and the chaos. The settlers retreated soon after, their numbers too few to stand against the Comanche warriors. By the time the sun rose, the village stood, battered but unbroken. Julia found Tahuka near the river, washing the blood from his hands. You didn't kill him, she said softly. He did not look at her. Not for his sake. She hesitated, then stepped closer. Then for whose? A long silence stretched between them. Finally, he met her gaze. For yours. Something inside her cracked open. She had hated him once, feared him, resented him. But now, standing before him, she saw him for what he truly was, not just a warrior. Not just the man forced into marriage by war, a man who had chosen mercy when vengeance would have been easier, a man she no longer hated. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of damp earth and smoke. The past could not be undone. But perhaps the future had yet to be written, and for the first time she did not fear it.
Year was 1877. The Wyoming plains, rolling across an endless stretch of untamed land. Moonlight cast jagged shadows over the Callaway Ranch, a grim monument of wealth and power carved out of the wilderness. Inside its walls, Evelyn McAllister stood frozen, her fists clenched at her sides as her father refused to meet her gaze. The flickering lantern light exaggerated the lines of his weathered face, but his silence cut deeper than any words. Silas Callaway sat at the head of the table, his presence commanding even in stillness. A man of iron and violence, he studied her with the cold detachment of a rancher inspecting livestock. "You'll marry my son," he said finally, his voice a slow grind to gravel. "That's not a request." Evie's breath hitched. The room felt smaller, suffocating. She turned to her father again, searching for even a glimmer of resistance, but his gaze remained locked on the rough wood of the table. "Papa, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Don't do this." Across from her, Jed Callaway leaned back in his chair, boots propped up against the table's edge. He smirked, dark eyes flickering with amusement, as he poured himself another drink. The whiskey sloshed over his fingers, but he didn't seem to care. "Ain't so bad, sweetheart," he drawled. "You're pretty enough. I'll treat you real good." A chorus of chuckles rumbled from the men around the table. Jed's gang, outlaws draped in dust and sin, men who had never known law outside the gun at their hip. Evie's nails bit into her palms. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she had nowhere to go. Silas held the land, the water, the law itself in his grasp. He had bought the sheriff, threatened every neighbor who dared defy him, and now, with her family drowning in debt, he had bought her, too. She refused to cry. Silas pushed back his chair and stood, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the room. "You think you got a choice in this?" His boots thudded heavily against the floor as he rounded the table, stopping inches from her. "A woman alone out here? You wouldn't last a week." His voice was almost gentle, but his grip wasn't when he grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him. "You'll marry my son. You'll bear his children, and you'll be grateful." Evie wrenched free, her heart hammering. I'll never be grateful, she spat. For the first time, something flickered in Silas's eyes. Amusement, admiration, even. We'll see about that, he said. Night swallowed the ranch house whole, but Evie didn't sleep. The walls of her small room pressing around her, the scent of dust and old wood suffocating. In the distance, drunken laughter echoed from the barn where Jed and his men celebrated their victory. Her fingers trembled as she pulled on her boots. She had no weapons, no food, no clear plan, but she had her legs, and she had the cover of darkness. That would have to be enough. The back door groaned as she slipped outside. The air was sharp, thick with the promise of rain. She moved fast, keeping to the shadows, her breath shallow. If she could make it past the ridge, she could lose herself in the trees. Maybe reach Fort Laramie before they caught her. A gun cocked behind her. Now, that ain't no way to start a marriage, Jed murmured. Evie turned slowly. He stood a few paces away, his revolver loose in his grip, his grin cruel and easy. Behind him, two of his men flanked him, their eyes gleaming with the thrill of the chase. She forced herself to meet his gaze. You don't want a wife, Jed. You want something to break. His smirk widened. Maybe, but Pa wants me to have you first. He grabbed her wrist, yanking her forward. She twisted, bringing her knee up hard. His breath exploded out in a curse as he doubled over. Evie ran. The shouts came fast, boots pounding behind her. She pushed harder, lungs burning. The distant trees her only hope. A shot rang out. A sharp sting tore across her arm, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Thunder rumbled overhead. The ridge loomed just ahead when another set of hands caught her, wrenching her back. The world spun, her body hitting the hard-packed dirt. Jed stood over her now, panting, furious. You little... Enough. Silas's voice sliced through the night like a blade. He strode toward them, his face carved from stone, his eyes unreadable. Jed let go, stepping back, but his rage still simmered just beneath the skin. Silas crouched beside her. That was foolish. Evie spat blood and dirt, her chest heaving. So was thinking I'd just accept this. A ghost of a smile tugged at his lips. You've got fire. That's good. He glanced at Jed. My son could use a woman with a backbone. Jed scoffed. She's got too much of one, if you ask me. Silas's gaze darkened. I didn't ask. Jed hesitated, then looked away. Silas turned back to her. Tomorrow you'll be married. Fight all you want, girl, but this is happening. The first raindrop hit Evie's cheek, mixing with the blood and sweat already there. Silas straightened, adjusted his coat as the wind picked up. Take her back, he ordered. Jed grabbed her arm again, tighter this time. Evie didn't resist. Not yet. As they dragged her back to the house, lightning split the sky, illuminating the endless stretch of land ahead. For now it was a cage, but cages could be broken, and so could men. The morning sky was bruised with storm clouds, the scent of wet earth heavy in the air. Beneath the looming gray, the Callaway Ranch stirred awake, its inhabitants slow-moving, nursing whiskey hangovers from a night before. The storm had passed, but the weight of its warning still clung to the air. Inside the drafty chapel on the outskirts of the ranch, Evelyn McAllister stood at the altar, her wrists raw beneath the tight grip of Jed Callaway's fingers. Her pulse pounded so loudly in her ears, she barely registered the preacher's droning voice. The man's words blurred together, each syllable another nail, sealing her fate. Jed reeked of alcohol, his shirt half-buttoned, his grin too wide. His grip tightened. Ain't no use fight it now, sweetheart. Evie swallowed against the bile rising in her throat. This wasn't a wedding. It was a public execution of her freedom. The preacher's voice cut through the haze. If anyone objects to this union... Evie struck. Her elbow rammed into Jed's gut, hard and fast. He grunted, doubling over, and in the split second that followed, she grabbed the knife from his belt and drove it into the back of his hand. Jed roared, jerking away, blood spilling across the dusty floor. The chapel exploded into chaos. Evie didn't look back. She ran, the knife still slick in her grip, her boots kicking up dust as she barreled past startled onlookers. Men shouted behind her. Chairs scraped, doors banged open. The weight of pursuit crashed against her like a wave. She didn't stop. The world outside the chapel was blindingly bright, the sun breaking through the clouds as if bearing witness to her defiance. A gunshot cracked the air, wood splintered beside her as a bullet slammed into the doorframe. Her legs burned as she sprinted past the barns, past the workers who stopped mid-task, their gazes flickering between horror and admiration. She didn't wait for anyone to make up their minds. Jed's voice thundered behind her. Catch her! The land stretched open before her, vast and unforgiving. Her only chance was the tree line in the distance, a dense spread of pines at the base of the hills. If she could reach it, she might have a chance. Another gunshot. A sharp sting tore through the flesh of her arm, white-hot pain searing through her senses. She gasped but kept running. The sound of hooves pounded behind her. They were gaining. A fallen log loomed ahead. Evie leaped, clearing it just as a hand brushed the back of her dress. She landed hard, pain jolting up her legs, but she forced herself forward. The trees were close now. Branches whipped against her face as she plunged into shadows, the scent of pine and damp earth wrapping around her like a cloak. The underbrush slowed her, roots twisting beneath her boots. The horses wouldn't be able to follow her here. A grim kind of hope took hold. Then a voice, too close. "You're dead, girl." Jed. She whirled just as he lunged, his bloodied hand reaching for her throat. She slashed out with a knife, but he caught her wrist, twisting until she cried out. The blade fell, landing uselessly in the dirt. "I was going to be real nice to you," he sneered. His grip tightened. "Now I ain't feeling so nice." Evie struggled, panic clawed at her ribs. She refused to let it end like this. She drove her knee upward, aiming for his groin. Jed anticipated it. He caught her leg, shoving her back. She stumbled, hit the ground hard, gasping as pain rattled through her ribs. He loomed over her, panting. His lip curled. No more running. Then the arrow struck. Jed's body jerked, his breath hitching in a strangled sound. He staggered back, hands fumbling at the wooden shaft now buried deep in his shoulder. A second arrow hissed through the air, embedding itself in the ground between them. Jed swore, his eyes darting wildly. Evie barely dared to breathe. From the trees, a figure stepped forward. Tall, clad in leather and adorned with intricate beads and feathers, the man moved with a quiet, deadly grace. His dark gaze locked onto Jed, his expression unreadable. Another arrow was already knocked in his bow. A warrior. Jed cursed under his breath. Damn savage. The warrior's face didn't change, but his grip on the bow tightened. Evie forced herself upright. Her breath came in sharp, uneven gasps, her wounded arm screaming in pain. Jed was bleeding badly now, his expression twisting between rage and fear. He took a step back, then another. He knew he was outmatched. "This ain't over," he spat. Then he turned and stumbled away, vanishing into the trees. Silence settled over the woods. Evie's pulse was a frantic drumbeat in her ears. The warrior lowered his bow, but didn't move closer. He studied her, his face unreadable, his stance still wary. Evie swallowed hard. "Thank you," she managed. He said nothing. The wind stirred between them, rustling the leaves overhead. For the first time since she fled the Callaway Ranch, she wasn't running, wasn't fighting. But she wasn't safe, either. This man, this stranger, had saved her life, but she had no idea if he intended to let her keep it. She took a shaky breath. "Who are you?" A long silence stretched between them before he finally answered. "Dakota?" His voice was low, steady, a name with weight. He motioned toward her bleeding arm. Evie hesitated. Then, with a slow nod, she stepped forward. The trees swallowed them whole. The sky was thick with the scent of rain, the kind that came before a storm. Smoke curled from the fires of the Cheyenne village, where the quiet hum of evening work had begun to settle into stillness. Evie sat by one of the smaller fires, her wounded arm wrapped in soft buckskin, her body sore from days of travel, but her mind sharper than it had ever been. She watched Dakota on the other side of the fire, his features unreadable as he carved a small piece of wood with slow, deliberate strokes. She had learned much in the short time she had spent among his people. They had not spoken many words to one another, but in the silence, understanding had grown. He had not treated her as a captive, nor as an intruder. She was simply there, healing, learning. He had saved her once, but he owed her nothing more. Still, the weight of uncertainty pressed against her ribs. Jed was out there. So was Silas. Men like them didn't let their property go so easily. As if summoned by her thoughts, a distant cry cut through the night air. A warning. Dakota stiffened. Others in the village rose, eyes turning toward the ridgeline. The first flicker of torchlight appeared in the darkness, then another, moving like fireflies. Too many to count. They had come. Evie's stomach twisted. She had known they would come, but not so soon. Dakota was already moving, calling orders in his own tongue. Warriors readied bows. Women and children were ushered toward the trees. Evie stood, but the weight of helplessness nearly buckled her legs. This wasn't her fight. This wasn't her home. But it was because of her that the Callaways were here. A horn blasted in the distance. The first gunshot rang out. The village erupted into motion. Arrows cut through the air, meeting the gunfire with silent precision. Shadows darted between tents. Warriors moving like ghosts, using the land as their ally. But the Callaways had numbers. Men on horseback charged, firing wildly. Silas's hired guns had come prepared. Evie ducked as a bullet split the post beside her. She had no weapon, no plan. Panic clawed at her throat. Across the battlefield, Dakota moved like a predator, his bow singing with each deadly strike. But even he could not stop them all. Then she saw him, Jed, weaving through the chaos, his wounded shoulders still stiff but his eyes alight with madness. He wasn't looking for battle. He was looking for her. She ran, not away, but toward the tents, where weapons had been left in the rush to defend the village. Her hands found the grip of a discarded rifle, the weight unfamiliar but solid. Jed spotted her. A slow grin curled across his bloodied lips. Time to go home, sweetheart. Evie raised the rifle. Her hand shook, but she held firm. Not with you. Jed's smirk didn't falter. He took a step closer. Come on now, Evie. You know how this ends. You ain't got the guts to pull that trigger. She wanted to believe he was wrong. Another step. The chaos around them faded. There was only Jed and the rifle and the choice she had spent her whole life running from. Her finger tightened on the trigger. Jed lunged. The shot rang out. For a second, she thought she had missed. Then Jed staggered. A hand pressed to his stomach, red spilling between his fingers. He looked at her, not with rage, but something close to disbelief. Then he fell. The breath tore from her lungs. But there was no time to feel it. Another figure loomed, this one larger, darker. Silas. His expression was unreadable, but the gun in his hand told her everything. She didn't have time to reload. Before Silas could fire, an arrow sliced through the air, embedding deep in his leg. He grunted, falling to one knee. Dakota appeared beside her, bow still raised, his eyes locked onto Silas like a wolf watching prey. Silas's gaze flickered between them, fury simmering beneath the surface. He knew he had lost. The village still stood. His men were dead or scattered, and his legacy, his son, lay bleeding in the dirt. He let out a slow, bitter laugh. You think you've won? Evie stepped forward, her voice steadier than she felt. I think I'm free. Silas met her eyes, and for the first time there was something like recognition there. Then he turned, limping away into the darkness. The battle was over. Morning came like a slow exhale, washing over the village in golden light. The dead had been buried, the wounded tended to. The Callaway threat had been severed, at least for now. Evie stood at the edge of the trees, watching the horizon. Dakota approached, his presence quiet, but she felt it all the same. You could stay, he said after a moment. She turned to him. He was offering her something without truly saying it. A place here, a chance to start over. But she already knew her answer. She smiled, small but sure. I need to find my own way. Dakota studied her, then nodded, not in approval, but in understanding. She had never belonged to Silas or to Jed, and though she had found safety here, She did not belong to this place, either. She belonged to herself. And for the first time in her life, that was enough. She took one last look at the village, at the people who had saved her, at the man who had taught her what strength truly was. Then she turned toward the open road and walked into the rising sun.
The wind howled across the open plains, carrying with it the distant scent of rain and smoke. Tokahe urged his horse forward, muscles coiled with unease, as he neared the ridge that overlooked his village. The hunt had taken him farther than he intended, but the fresh game tied to his saddle would bring joy to Wiyaka. He imagined her soft laughter, the way her dark eyes shimmered when she teased him about staying away too long. The thought quickened his pace, then he saw it. Thick columns of smoke coiled toward the heavens, black against the bleeding hues of the setting sun. The village, his home, was ablaze. His heartbeat hammered against his ribs, his breath caught between fear and disbelief. He dug his heels into his horse's flanks, the animal responding with a desperate gallop. The rhythmic pounding of hooves against dry earth blurred into a hollow roar in his ears. Bodies littered the ground, some sprawled where they had fallen, arrows still embedded in their backs. Others were charred, blackened husks barely recognizable. Beneath the ruined teepees, the scent of burned flesh, gunpowder, and spilled blood clung to the air like a curse. His people, warriors, elders, children, slaughtered without mercy. He leaped from his horse, his hands shaking as he turned over a fallen warrior. His uncle. A deep wound gaped across the old man's chest, his lifeless hands still curled around a knife too small to have saved him. Tokahe swallowed the bile rising in his throat. His village had not gone down without a fight. The tracks in the dirt told a story of struggle, of bodies dragged and trampled under hooves. Whoever did this came not only to kill, but to take. He stumbled forward, his pulse pounding with a terrible certainty. Wiyaka. He ran past the collapsed remains of the chief's lodge, past the shattered pottery, past the lifeless faces of those he had known since childhood. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as he searched, as his mind refused to accept what his heart already knew. Then, near the great tree where the children played, he saw her. She lay draped over a fallen warrior, her slender hands clutching, his tunic as if she had tried to shield him from the attack. A bloom of crimson spread across her white buckskin dress, a single bullet wound in her back. Her long braids, once woven with bright beads, were tangled with dirt and blood. The delicate lines of her face were peaceful, almost as if she had merely fallen asleep beneath the evening sky. Tokahe dropped to his knees beside her. His hands trembled as he brushed her hair from her face, his thumb tracing the cool skin of her cheek. A distant ringing filled his ears, drowning out everything else, the rustling of wind through broken teepees, the crackling of smoldering fires, the croaking of scavenger birds. He had not been here to protect her. His vision blurred with tears, grief pressing against his ribs like an iron weight. He should have been here. He should have fought. He should have died alongside her, but grief quickly sharpened into something else. Vengeance. His fingers tightened around the beaded necklace she always wore, the one he had given her on the night of their betrothal. He lifted his gaze from her, still form, his dark eyes burning with fury as they traced the ground. The signs of the attack were unmistakable, tracks left by men on horseback, their boots cutting deep into the soil. A Colt revolver, its handle worn from use, lay discarded, beside a bloodied saddle blanket. A name was etched into the brass plating. Black Coyote Gang. Tokahe had heard the stories. Outlaws who did not belong to any one side, preying upon both settlers and natives alike. Mercenaries without honor, men who laughed while spilling the blood of the innocent. His hands clenched into fists. He would find them. And when he did, he would carve their names into the earth with their own blood. The first streaks of twilight painted the sky as he stood. His grief, his sorrow, he would carry them. But he would not be broken by them. He would be forged in them, but vengeance would have to wait. A distant howl echoed through the trees, the unmistakable cry of wolves drawn to the scent of the dead. He turned, his gaze sweeping over the ruined remains of his home. He could not leave them to be devoured by the beasts. His people deserved honor in death. With quiet reverence he began his work. He moved the bodies of the fallen into a clearing, gathering stones to mark their resting places. He worked through the night, sweat and sorrow mingling as he whispered prayers to the spirits. When he finally reached Wiyaka, his hands hesitated. How could he bury her? How could he place her beneath the earth, knowing he would never hear her voice again? He knelt beside her, his forehead resting against hers. "I will find them," he murmured, his voice raw, "and I will make them suffer." As dawn crept over the land, he placed her beaded necklace around his neck. It was his last tether to her, the last piece of her warmth he could carry. He turned his back on the graves, on the smoldering ruins of his past. His path was set. The Black Coyote gang had taken everything from him. Now he would take everything from them. The trail was not hard to follow. Hoofprints marked the earth, fresh and deep, cutting a path westward. The outlaws had ridden hard through the night, but they were reckless. Empty cartridge casings gleamed in the dust. A half-eaten biscuit lay trampled near an abandoned fire pit, and the unmistakable stench of whiskey clung to the dirt. These men had not feared pursuit. They had believed themselves untouchable. Tokahe moved like a shadow, silent and swift. His knife rested easily in his grip, his bow slung over his back, an arrow always within reach. The plains stretched endless before him, but he knew this land better than they ever could. The outlaws rode on stolen Lakota ponies, bred for endurance but unfamiliar with their new masters. The animals' prints faltered in places, straying from the straight path, resisting the reins. The gang may have left him nothing, but in their arrogance, they had given him a trail as clear as any hunter could hope for. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long fingers of dusk across the land. He spotted a fresh sign, a strip of torn cloth snagged on a thorn bush still damp with sweat. He was close. Then he smelled smoke. Keeping low, he crept through the tall grass, inching toward the source. A small fire flickered within a natural rock formation, partially sheltered from the wind. 5 men sat around it, their laughter sharp and careless against the quiet of the night. Their rifles leaned against boulders, their boots kicked off as they passed a bottle between them. One of them, a wiry man with a scar across his cheek, clutched a necklace of bright beads. Wiyaka's necklace. Tokahe's breath turned to stone in his chest. The man twirled the beads between his fingers, a smirk twisting his face. "Damn. Shame we couldn't keep that little doe," he said, tossing the necklace into the dirt. "Pretty thing." The others chuckled. One spat into the fire. "Chief's girl, wasn't she? Bet that warrior's out there somewhere, crying over her." Tokahe did not feel the ground beneath him, did not feel the night air. There was only the firelight flickering against their faces, the sound of their laughter slicing through his skull like a jagged knife. He moved before his mind could catch up. An arrow found its mark in the throat of the man who had spoken, cutting off his laughter in a gurgle of blood. Before the others could react, Tokahe was already in motion. He crashed into the wiry outlaw, his knife flashing in the firelight. The man barely had time to scream before the blade sank into his ribs. Chaos erupted. The remaining 3 scrambled for their weapons, their drunken reflexes sluggish, their movements clumsy. Another arrow flew, burying itself in a bandit's chest. He crumpled without a sound. The last 2 managed to grab their rifles, but Tokahe was already gone, melting into the shadows beyond the firelight. One man fired blindly into the darkness, his breathing ragged, his hands shaking, then silence. The wind stirred the flames, making the shadows dance. "Where is he?" the last outlaw hissed. A whisper of movement behind him was his only answer. Tokahe's knife found his throat, and he fell to his knees, blood spilling into the dust. Only one remained now, the leader of this small group, a man with a tangled beard and cruel eyes. He clutched his revolver, scanning the darkness, his breath coming in short gasps. "Come on out, you bastard!" he shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. Tokahe stepped forward, just beyond the firelight, his face an unreadable mask. This outlaw raised his gun, but his hands trembled. He knew he wouldn't be fast enough. "You—" he started, but the word never finished. Tokahe's arrow took him in the chest. The man staggered back, wheezing, his fingers scrabbling at the shaft, as if he could rip death from his body. Then he was still. Tokahe stood over the bodies, his heart steady, his breathing even. He did not look away. These men had stolen everything from him. Now they were nothing but echoes in the dirt. He bent down and retrieved the necklace from where it had been discarded. The beads were warm from the fire, but to him they felt colder than the night air. He ran his thumb over them once, then placed them back around his neck. The wind shifted, carrying with it the distant sound of a horse approaching. Tokahe tensed, his bow at the ready, until he saw the rider. A tall man sat atop a dark gelding, his silhouette sharp against the moonlit horizon. His hat was pulled low, but the glint of a revolver at his hip and the way he held the reins with the ease of a man who had lived and killed by them marked him as dangerous. Tokahe watched as the rider dismounted, his boots crunching against the dirt. He took in the scene before him, 5 dead men, a dying fire, and a warrior standing amid the carnage. The man let out a low whistle. "Hell of a night you've had." Tokahe did not lower his bow. He did not trust men who moved so easily between shadow and light. The stranger raised his hands, palms open. "Easy now. Name's Elias Cade." His voice was calm, edged with something unreadable. "And I ain't here to fight you." Tokahe said nothing. Elias nudged one of the bodies with the toe of his boot. "Black Coyote boys." He glanced back at Tokahe. "You got a grudge against him, or was this just a bad run-in?" Tokahe's jaw clenched. "They killed my people." Elias nodded as if that was all he needed to hear. "Then we got something. In common." Tokahe studied him, searching for deceit. Elias was older, his face lined with dust and regret, but his eyes were sharp, wary. A man who had seen too much, done too much. "You hunt them?" Tokahe asked. Elias gave a slow nod. "Once. Rode with them for a time, till they turned on me." He flexed the fingers of his left hand where a faint scar ran across the knuckles. "They don't leave loose ends, except I ain't so easy to kill." Silence stretched between them. The fire crackled low. "I know where they're holed up," Elias said at last. "A mining town out west, abandoned now, but the gang's taken it over. Silas Boone, their leader, is waiting there with the rest." Tokahe's grip on his bow tightened. Boone. The name burned in his memory. He had heard it whispered in the village before the massacre, spoken with fear. Elias studied him. "You can keep picking them off one by one, or you can come with me. Do it right." Tokahe hesitated. He had never needed another's help before. But vengeance was a fire that burned slow, and he knew that a lone warrior, no matter how skilled, could not take on an entire gang. Finally he nodded. Elias smirked. "Thought you might see reason." He turned toward his horse, then glanced back. "Get some rest, Lakota. We ride at dawn." Tokahe watched as the man disappeared into the night, leaving him alone once more. He looked down at the necklace around his neck, at the bodies that lay still in the dust. This was only the beginning. The hunt was far from over. The wind carried the scent of dust and iron as Tokahe crouched on the ridgeline, staring down at the abandoned mining town below. Shadows stretched long across the ground, the last light of day melting behind the jagged peaks. The buildings, once a promise of fortune, now stood as hollowed shells, their windows dark, their wood splintered by neglect. But this town was far from empty. Men moved between the structures, their boots scuffing against the dry earth. Gun barrels glinted in the fading sun, and the occasional burst of laughter drifted up from the saloon. There were at least 20, maybe more. The Black Coyote gang had made this place their fortress, their refuge. But tonight, it would become their grave. Elias knelt beside Tokahe, his hat pulled low, his revolver already resting in his calloused hand. "Boone's in there," he muttered, nodding toward the largest building, the old foreman's house. "Always sits near the back, likes to drink himself stupid before sundown." Tokahe's jaw tightened. He had imagined this moment 100 times. Silas Boone, the man who had ordered the massacre of his people, the man who had let his men slaughter Wiyaka and take her necklace as a trinket, the man who had laughed while his village burned. Boone did not know it yet, but the ghosts of those he had killed were coming for him. The plan was simple: strike fast, strike hard, no mercy. Elias exhaled, checked the bullets in his revolver. "Are you sure about this?" Tokahe's grip tightened around his bow. "I have never been more sure of anything." They moved like wraiths, slipping between the shadows, the night cloaking them in silence. The first sentry barely had time to register the arrow that pierced his throat before he crumpled against the wall. Another outlaw turned, eyes widening. Tokahe's knife found his ribs before a cry could leave his lips. Elias worked methodically, his shots precise, his movements unhurried. A gunshot rang out, and a man collapsed near the stables, blood pooling beneath him. Then the stillness shattered. A shout erupted from the saloon, boots pounded against wood, and suddenly the town was alive with chaos. Lanterns flared, shadows jerked across the buildings. Men cursed and scrambled for their weapons. Tokahe ducked behind a water trough as bullets split the air, wood splintering around him. He knocked an arrow, loosed it into the throat of a man barreling toward Elias with a shotgun. The outlaw spun, gurgled, fell face first into the dirt. The street turned into a battlefield. Elias moved with deadly grace, firing, reloading, firing again, each shot finding its mark. Tokahe weaved through the madness, his knife flashing in the firelight, his arrows striking true. The gang had numbers, but numbers meant nothing if they could not see their enemy before it was too late. A rifle cracked from a rooftop, the bullet kicking up dirt near Tokahe's foot. He rolled, loosed an arrow in return. A scream. The rifle clattered to the ground. One by one, the outlaws fell, but the gang was not without fight. A burly man charged Elias, knocking him to the ground, a knife slashing downward. Elias grunted, barely managing to deflect the blade before it plunged into his chest. Tokahe moved before thought, launching himself at the attacker, his own blade finding flesh. The outlaw gasped, stumbled back, then fell. Elias grunted, wiping blood from his face. "Damn. Didn't see that one coming." Tokahe hauled him to his feet. "Stay sharp." Then the saloon doors burst open. A lone figure stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards groaning beneath his weight. Silas Boone, even from a distance, Tokahe recognized him. The scars along his jaw, the cruel glint in his eyes. Boone carried himself like a man who had never once doubted his own power, his revolver dangling at his side, as if he believed himself untouchable. He scanned the street, took in the bodies of his men sprawled across the ground. Then he smiled. "Well, shall be damned," he drawled. "Ain't this a surprise?" Tokahe stepped forward, his breath steady, his hands calm. "You know why I'm here." Boone chuckled, shaking his head. "I figured you'd come sniffing around eventually. Thought we left you dead with the rest of your kind." He spread his arms. "Guess I was wrong." Tokahe did not respond. There was no need for words. Boone sighed, as if this was all a terrible inconvenience. "Look, son, I get it. You want revenge, that's real sweet and all, but let's be honest here. You really think you're walking away from this?" Elias cocked his revolver. "I'd say the odds are in his favor." Boone smirked. "We'll see about that." Then he moved. His gun was fast, faster than any outlaw Tokahe had faced before. But Tokahe was faster. He dropped low as the bullet tore past his ear, his own arrow already loosed before Boone could fire again. The arrow struck Boone's shoulder, spinning him sideways, but he did not go down. He staggered, snarled, raised. His gun. A second arrow struck him, this time in the thigh. Boone fell to one knee, cursing, blood pouring from the wounds. Tokahe stepped closer. Boone's breath came in ragged gasps, his fingers tightening around his revolver. But before he could lift it again, Tokahe's knife flashed, knocking the gun from his grasp. For the first time there was fear in Boone's eyes. Tokahe knelt, his face inches from the man who had stolen everything from him. "You killed my people," Boone gritted his teeth. "They were nothing but savages." Tokahe's knife found Boone's gut. Boone gasped, his body jerking, blood spilling over his hands. Tokahe did not blink, did not waver. He watched as Boone's breath shuddered, as his strength faded, as his life drained from his body like water through cracked earth. When it was over, he stood. Elias exhaled, holstering his gun. "Well, that's that." Tokahe said nothing. He turned, stepping over the bodies, past the smoldering remnants of battle. past the ghosts that whispered through the ruined town. The vengeance that had driven him, that had burned in his chest like a second heartbeat, had been satisfied, but the ache remained. Wiaka was still gone. His people were still gone, and no amount of blood could bring them back. Elias fell into, step beside him. You got any plans now? Tokahi looked to the horizon. The stars stretched endless above them, the wind whispering through the darkened land. No, he said. Elias nodded, as if he understood. Well, if you're looking for a fight, there's always another out there. Tokahi said nothing. Mounted his horse, the necklace still resting against his chest. Then, without a word, he rode into the night, leaving the dead behind him.